The year is around 500 BCE. The eastern provinces of the Zhou dynasty are crumbling. The once unified empire, bound by sacred rituals and ancient order, is now fractured into dozens of feuding states. Warlords redraw borders on whim, assassinations strike down rulers in their sleep, and the rhythm of life is set not by the harvest, but by the march of armies. Through this chaos walks a man in plain hemp robes, tall and dignified, carrying bamboo scrolls instead of weapons. His steps are steady, his eyes calm, but in his mind burns an idea more radical than any sword. Society can be saved, not through conquest, but through virtue. His name? Confucius, later Latinized by Jesuit scholars into Confucius. His mission? To reorder the human heart before attempting to reorder the state. And yet, despite becoming the moral architect of East Asia, Confucius died believing he had failed. The irony? His failure would survive dynasties, revolutions, and even attempts to erase his name. Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, in today's Shandong province. His father, a respected military officer, died when Confucius was just 3 years old, leaving the family in poverty. His mother raised him alone, and though his household lacked wealth, it was rich in tradition. China at the time was in its spring and autumn period, a misleadingly poetic name for an age of almost constant warfare. The Zhou kings were rulers in name only. Real power lay in the hands of local lords, who often waged war for petty gains. Corruption seeped into every level of governance. Rituals that once bound society together were ignored or performed mechanically, stripped of meaning. For a boy with an acute sense of order and justice, this was a world gone mad. While others dreamed of power, Confucius dreamed of restoring balance. And he believed the key was hidden not in the future, but in the past, in the wisdom of the ancients. Confucius devoted himself to study. He immersed himself in the 5 classics, works like the Book of Songs, with its folk poetry and political hymns, the Book of Rites, which detailed ceremonies down to the tilt of a cup, and the Book of Documents, containing speeches from ancient rulers. But for him, these were not dusty archives. They were living manuals for creating a just society. He argued that moral decay began when leaders abandoned Li, ritual propriety, and Ren, benevolence, for personal gain. By his 20s, Confucius was already teaching, but he did not merely lecture. He mentored, questioned, and provoked thought. His vision was not academic, it was political. He wanted to heal the body of the state. In the state of Lu, he rose through the ranks to become Minister of Justice. Under his policies, crime plummeted. Disputes were settled with fairness, and even foreign visitors remarked on the newfound order. For a moment, it seemed the tide was turning. But morality is a dangerous weapon in the wrong arena, and the court of Lu was a place where virtue made enemies.
The nobleman treasures good teaching. If your heart finds worth in these words, let your hand act, subscribe, and follow. Even the longest journey begins with a single step.
Jealous factions at court conspired against him, undermining his authority. When a neighboring state sent Lu's duke a lavish gift of dancers and horses, the ruler abandoned his duties for pleasure. Confucius condemned it openly. That sealed his fate. At around age 50, he left Lu, not in disgrace, but in determination, and began a 14-year journey through the fractured states of China. In Wei, he urged the ruler to govern by moral example. The ruler nodded, and then asked Confucius about military strategy instead. In Song, his teachings were seen as a threat to aristocratic privilege. An assassination attempt nearly claimed his life. In Chen, a political blockade left him and his disciples without food for days, forcing them to survive on wild herbs. Yet even in hardship, he continued to teach. His disciples recorded his words and observed how he lived, always courteous, always measured, always embodying the principles he preached. And through these years, Confucius's idea matured. Leadership was not about commands, but about character. By the end of his life, Confucius had taught an estimated 3,000 students. Among them, 72 became prominent figures in government and culture. His classrooms were not palaces. They were open courtyards, shaded by trees, where the conversation flowed like a river. He taught that a ruler's moral example was more powerful than any law. Lead the people with virtue, he said, and they will reform themselves. His method was dialogic. He asked questions, encouraged debate, and demanded self-reflection. One day, when asked what defined a junzi, a nobleman, Confucius replied, "He is modest in speech but exceeds in action." But history can be cruel. When Confucius died in 479 BCE, none of his reforms had been institutionalized. The wars raged on. He was mourned, but his vision seemed buried with him. His disciples, however, had preserved his teachings in the Analects, a collection of dialogues, moral sayings, and vivid anecdotes. For a century, these circulated quietly. Then, during the Han Dynasty, rulers searching for a unifying philosophy found in Confucius the perfect ideological backbone. By 136 BCE, Confucian classics became the foundation of the imperial examination system. For the next 2 millennia, anyone who aspired to serve in government had to master his ideas. This transformed Confucius from a wandering teacher into the central moral authority of Chinese civilization. His influence radiated beyond China, into Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, shaping everything from political etiquette to family structures. And yet, the same teachings that fostered stability could also ossify society, a paradox that still sparks debate today. When Jesuit missionaries arrived in China in the 16th century, they studied Confucius's works and brought them back to Europe. Voltaire hailed him as a philosopher free of superstition. Enlightenment thinkers saw him as proof that morality could be built without divine revelation. In the 20th century, however, his reputation swung wildly. During China's Cultural Revolution, he was denounced as a symbol of feudal oppression. Red Guards destroyed his statues and temples. Yet today, his image has been rehabilitated. The Chinese government sponsors Confucius institutes across the globe, framing him as an ambassador of cultural harmony. Perhaps this is his final irony, that a man who sought truth over politics became a political symbol for every era that claimed him. Confucius never claimed to be a prophet. He said, "I am a transmitter, not a creator. I believe in and love the ancients." Yet in transmitting the past, he reshaped the future. His sayings still echo, "Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. To see what is right and not do it is the want of courage. Learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous." And here's the question back to you. If you were a ruler in the chaos of 5th century BCE China, would you have listened to the man who told you that the strongest fortress was a virtuous heart?
The thoughtful hold onto words worth keeping. Walk with me and be among the rare few who stay. Subscribe and join them.